Here's how you can get rich in Diablo 2 Resurrected Ladder Season 1, by simply paying attention to and picking up and selling items that have previously not been as valuable but are now much more valuable given the new skills rebalancing, new rune words and such, and new mercenary options. Since every class received changes and buffs, with new builds rising to the top in terms of popularity for the ladder, this guide primarily focuses on profiting from previously underused items and new items that these very builds will be utilizing. So with that, let's get into the first category of items, which is the new rune words of patch 2.4. As many of these will see use in my opinion, with even a few of them becoming best in slot items for several meta builds. It would thus be wise to not only keep an eye out for the runes that are used in these rune words, but also some of the more optimal bases that are used to construct them. First, we have Flickering Flame, which can be built in 3 socketed helms including Druid Pelts with Neth, Pull, and Vex. So for this, you definitely want to especially keep an eye out for Druid Pelts, which are the Druid helmets of course, that have +3, preferably to 2 different fire skills like Armageddon, and I believe Volcano is probably the other good one. By the way, and this pretty much applies to all other rune word bases as well, but you should also keep an eye out for white rune word bases or white items, especially Druid Pelts. If they can roll, for example, really good fire skills, you can actually use the Horadric Cube or use Larzuk to get your guaranteed sockets. Well, with the Horadric Cube is not guaranteed, so if you get really great +3 like fire skills, you definitely want to use Larzuk for the socket quests to then maximize the number of sockets on the helm to be able to sell it for a pretty profit. Anyhow, next up we have Obsession, which can be built with Zod, Is, Lem, Lum, Ionef in staves. And the first major thing here is that it's made the Zod rune a lot more valuable than before, although you'll probably not be very likely to find a Zod rune anyway, but just know that it's going to be a lot more expensive to secure one compared to before, where Jaw and Burr were the primary high runes that people were coveting after. Anyhow, even if you don't end up finding any Zod runes, this item is still going to shake up the meta of item fighting at least by quite a bit, especially with how frequently staves drop, right? Because you want to be looking for staff bases, which may roll up to +3 to 3 skills. So you want to look for the most useful skills for sorceresses based on what's meta right now, which is mainly Hydra and Nova, as well as any of the main cold skills, Frozen Orb and Blizzard. So you want to get +3 in any of these skills, and also +3 in the respective masteries. And then the last +3 can just be sort of a bonus. It can be used like on a secondary spammable skill like Fireball, for example, if that's part of the build at all. But if you get +3 to 3 different skills that are actually all going to be useful, that'll be the makings of a very godly base, which you can of course get Larzuk to socket as well, but even a white staff with those types of plus skills can be extremely valuable in my opinion. Oh, and another bonus is if you find ethereal staves, you should pick them up as well, because Obsession uses Zod, right, which obviously makes them indestructible. And next up we have the sort of mid-game rune word Wisdom, also for helms, which is not only good for the newly revamped Throw Barb and also Boazon, but also just a good physical damage character item in general with Cannot Be Frozen and attack rating bonuses. Now the next set of rune words, both new and old, are primarily going to be useful for the newly buffed mercenaries, mainly the Act 1 Rogue, Act 3 Desert Wolf, or Iron Wolf rather, and the Act 5 Barbarian, who is actually getting 1 extra spec and will be able to dual wield one-handed swords. Plus, they'll also be able to cast Taunt, making them quite useful for squishier characters like casters and range characters, and also be able to utilize the When Struck mod on their gear. And of course, one more thing about mercenary gear before we get into the rune words is that ethereal items are preferred because they don't actually lose any durability from mercenary use. And with that, let's get into some Act 5 Barb Merc gear, starting with Unbending Will, which can be used in or socketed in any type of sword, so it can be one-handed or two-handed swords, and thus it's actually usable by both types of Barb Mercs. Now, I don't actually think this will see as much use compared to some of the other rune words I'm about to show you, at least for the Act 5 Merc, but it's definitely a great budget option, and its primary benefit is the taunt that it can cast. But again, for the Barb Merc, especially if people opt for the dual wield option, it can actually cast taunt by default, and thus not really requiring you to have this rune word to be able to do that. And next up, we also have another new rune word primarily for barb mercs, and that's Plague. And this can be a bit more expensive because of the Cham rune that it requires. But I think this will actually be one of the best endgame options, especially for casters, when you combine it with a taunting barb merc, since it has the ability to cast lower resist when struck. And also having a level 17 cleansing aura to boot, making this a very good contender against the Act 2 Infinity Merc, at least for lightning characters, right? Because lower resist doesn't actually break immunities, so it doesn't really matter for other elemental types, but for lightning specifically, you do need Infinity, whether it be you equip it on your main character, or you have a Fist of Heaven's Paladin like you see here, or you use the Act 2 Infinity Merc. And speaking of Infinity, you can now also make them in spears, making the Man Catcher another decent option for the Act 2 Merc for Infinity. So you definitely want to be looking out for them, both, obviously the white and the gray, which are ethereal and or socketed versions of them. And not only that, but spears also include Amazon spears. On top of the Spearazon being buffed, you also want to be looking for matriarchal pikes with +3 javelin and spear skills for the Amazon. Now, going back to the Act 5 support mercenary barb, the other option that will be really good in my opinion, and this is actually super cheap, is Lawbringer in a sword. This will not only give him a chance to cast Decrepify on striking, which by the way does break physical immunities, but will also give you yet another aura in the form of Sanctuary aura on top of another one that you might already have, such as with Plague. Now for some honorable mentions when it comes to mercenary weapon choices before we move on to the next item type. Obedience, which is not only a good budget option for the Desert Merc, but also for shape-shifting druids and even, I suppose, Spearazons, giving us even more reasons to look for man catchers and also other spears like matriarchal pikes and other perhaps lesser Amazon spears. And next, Insight, which has been primarily used for the mana regeneration, but actually sports pretty decent damage and attack rating as well, can now also be socketed into bows, making them useful for rogues and even sort of mid-game Amazons, and thus again giving us more reason to hunt for bow bases, right? And by the way, bows cannot be ethereal, so you just want to look for, well, obviously you can only find like normal bows and superior bows. Oh, and they can also be put into crossbows, although the rogue cannot use crossbows, but can actually now use Amazon bows in addition to their normal bows. And now moving on from rune words, there are actually also some white and also socketed items that have become really good, starting with the scepters, namely 5 socketed scepters, or white scepters that you can get 5 sockets with Larzuk, that have Conviction Aura, Fist of the Heavens. These are the main 2 skills that you want +3 in. And for these, you definitely want to get the War Scepter / Divine Scepter. So the War Scepter is the normal version, Divine Scepter Exceptional, and Caduceus, however you pronounce that, the elite version, because these are the only types of scepters that can roll your 5 sockets, which by the way, if you want a really, really godly, for example, Fist of the Heavens weapon, you can even socket it with 5 lightning facets to get something crazy like this. And this is just one main example of a socketed or white item that can be good. Other examples include ones that involve skills and builds that have been buffed with the patch, right? Such as martial arts assassins. So for that, you can look for claws, right? With plus martial arts skills, namely Phoenix Strike, I believe is the main skill they'll be using. And obviously you have druid pelts, and you can also look for like Amazon bows, right? And spears as well. And items to look for definitely don't stop at white and socketed items, right? For example, rares that involve some of these skills that have been recently buffed up can be really good and godly and worth a lot as well, like this druid pelt right here. Even magic items with the right plus skills can be really good as well, right? For example, for trap assassins, also fire druids. In terms of assassins, you want to look for claws with like +3 to traps, right? And also +3 to a specific trap. And speaking of which, fire trap assassins might be a thing as well, or it might be more of a gimmicky build, but it's actually a lot more viable than before, right? So you don't necessarily also need to look for just the meta, like the most top meta builds like Fist of the Heavens or like the Fire Druid or like even the martial arts assassins, but even some of the other lesser used skills have become somewhat or a lot more viable compared to before, which means that there might be some demand for it, or at least a lot more demand for these types of items as well compared to before. And so along these lines, you obviously also want to be keeping an eye out for unique items like Bartuk's Cutthroat, which is one of the best martial arts weapons, and also things like the Hand of Blessed Light for Fist of the Heaven Paladins, Jalal's Mane for Shapeshifting Druids, which by the way is another build that's been buffed, and finally last but not least, Raven Lore. Well, actually not last, right, because there are a ton more uniques that you can, check out, but Raven Lore is pretty good for Fire Druids too. And some other examples include throwing weapons for the newly buffed, significantly buffed throw barbs, and also even items like Wizard Spike, which can be great for Nova sorceresses because of how mana hungry they are and the amount of faster cast rate that they need, which, both of which comes from the Wizard Spike, despite not having any plus skills, right? So this is just an example of an item that on surface level doesn't really look that valuable, especially with assumptions from, the previous patch or like the previous meta, which lasted for like decades, right? But a lot of things have actually changed with this new patch. And especially since I don't think the meta has completely been figured out, with people just barely starting on the ladder, especially in terms of item prices and trading values. So I think if you actually keep a sharp eye and actually pick up some of these items that could actually be good and are sort of running under the radar for now, once the meta becomes more solved, a lot of these items might actually pick up in demand, especially if people start making guides about, certain builds and what's good and whatnot. A lot of these aforementioned items, I believe, will actually become a lot more valuable. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in today's guide. Well, I guess there's one last thing that I can mention, and it's skillers. So Grand Charms for some of the new skills that were buffed up, you should also keep an eye out for, right? Like, for example, martial arts skillers will probably be a lot better compared to before. But that's probably the last thing I want to say. If you have anything you want to share that I perhaps missed about what could be valuable and how to become rich in Diablo 2 Resurrected Ladder Season 1, be sure to comment down below and I'll definitely reply to your comment. So with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Happy hunting and happy treasure fighting. Peace.